I should have spoken about this years ago. Perhaps if I had, someone might have understood what happened at the Aldrich estate during the winter of 2007. But discretion was part of my contract, and the Aldrich family paid well for silence. Even now, 15 years later, I can still feel the weight of that sealed door and the impossible warmth that radiated from behind it. My name is irrelevant. What matters is that I served as estate manager for the Aldrich Winter Retreat, a sprawling chalet nestled 3,000 feet above Gstaad. The family had owned the property for 4 generations, each adding their own architectural flourishes to what had once been a modest alpine lodge. By the time I arrived, it sprawled across 7 levels, with 42 rooms and corridors that seemed to fold back on themselves like a well-tailored maze. The sealed guest room occupied the 3rd floor's eastern wing. I discovered it during my first week, while conducting the mandatory inventory that came with my position. Unlike every other door in the estate, this one bore no brass nameplate, no room number, no key hanging from the master ring that Mrs. Aldrich had entrusted to me. The door itself was unremarkable, dark walnut, same as the others, except for the heavy wax seal pressed across the jamb. Mrs. Aldrich found me standing there, studying the crimson wax that bore her family's coat of arms. "That room stays closed," she said simply. "How long has it been sealed?" I asked, though something in Mrs. Aldrich's expression suggested this was not a conversation she welcomed. "Since 1973. Her voice carried the particular crispness that wealthy widows use when they expect obedience without explanation. And my late husband's instructions were very specific. "The room remains untouched, the seal unbroken." I nodded, but my eyes lingered on the wax. It looked fresh, despite her claim of a 34-year seal. The edges showed no cracking, no dust accumulation, none of the aging one would expect. I made a mental note to investigate the estate's maintenance records. "Is there anything else I should know about the room?" I pressed gently. Mrs. Aldrich's pale blue eyes fixed on mine with uncomfortable intensity. "Nothing that concerns your duties, Mr. Hayes. You'll find your responsibilities clearly outlined in the Manor Handbook. Everything you need to know is there," but it wasn't. I spent that evening in my quarters, a comfortable suite on the ground floor, reading through the estate's operational manual. The document was thorough, 47 pages detailing everything from the heating system's winter protocols to the specific crystal used for formal dinners. Yet the sealed guest room earned only a single line: 3rd floor East Wing guest suite. Access restricted, maintenance not required. No explanation, no historical context. Nothing about why a room would remain sealed for over 3 decades, or who had ordered such an unusual arrangement. The first winter night brought the discovery that would haunt me for months to come. I was completing my evening rounds, a ritual Mrs. Aldrich insisted upon despite the estate's comprehensive security system, when I noticed light emanating from beneath the sealed door. Not electric light. This glow carried the warm, dancing quality of firelight, the kind that comes from burning logs rather than gas flames. I pressed my ear to the door and heard what sounded unmistakably like wood crackling in a hearth. I stood there for nearly 10 minutes, listening to the gentle snap and whisper of a fire that shouldn't exist. The sealed room had no electrical connection, according to the building schematics I'd studied. More importantly, no one had entered the room. I carried the only master keys and the wax seal remained intact. The next morning, I mentioned the incident to Klaus, the estate's head of maintenance, a Swiss man in his 60s who'd worked for the Aldrich family since the 1980s. Klaus possessed the kind of institutional knowledge that comes from decades of discretion. "You saw light under the door?" Klaus asked, his English heavily accented but precise, "and heard a fire burning. But that's impossible, isn't it?" Klaus was quiet for a long moment, his weathered hands working over a wrench he'd been using to adjust the main heating system. "Many things are impossible here," he said finally. "The family pays us to maintain the possible and ignore the rest." Klaus's words troubled me more than the mysterious firelight. In my 20 years managing properties for the ultra-wealthy, I'd learned that every estate harbored secrets. The rich buy privacy with the same casual efficiency they buy art or automobiles. But this felt different. This felt like a secret buying itself. I began keeping a log, noting each night the sealed room displayed signs of activity. The pattern emerged quickly. Every night between the 15th of November and the 1st of March, light would seep from under that door. Every night, the soft crackle of burning wood would whisper through the walls, and every morning the room would return to absolute silence. The estate's heating bills puzzled me. Despite the chalet's massive size and the brutal alpine winter, our fuel costs remained remarkably low, so I cross-referenced the numbers with similar properties I'd managed in Aspen and the French Alps. The Aldrich estate consumed 30% less heating fuel than comparable homes, an efficiency that defied explanation. Mrs. Aldrich arrived for her extended winter stay in mid-December, bringing with her the usual retinue of personal staff and social obligations. I mentioned neither the mysterious firelight nor the heating anomaly. Experience had taught me that wealthy clients preferred their estate managers to be invisible, efficient, and strategically incurious. But curiosity, once awakened, proves difficult to suppress. I found myself lingering on the third floor during my evening rounds, drawn to that warm glow like a moth to flame that shouldn't burn. The breakthrough came on Christmas Eve, when Mrs. Aldrich summoned me to her study for our weekly review. The room reflected her personality perfectly. Antique furniture arranged with mathematical precision, family portraits watching from gilded frames, and a fire crackling in the marble hearth that cast dancing shadows across Persian rugs worth more than most people's homes. "Hayes," she began, settling into a leather chair that probably cost more than my annual salary. "Klaus tells me you've been asking questions about the sealed room." I felt my stomach tighten. "Only to ensure I'm fulfilling my duties properly, Mrs. Aldrich." She studied me with those pale blue eyes that missed nothing. "Your duties, as outlined in your contract, include maintaining the estate's operational efficiency and respecting the family's privacy. The sealed room falls under the second category. Of course, I simply noticed some unusual heating patterns and wanted to ensure everything was functioning correctly." Mrs. Aldrich reached for a crystal decanter, pouring herself 2 fingers of what I recognized as Macallan 25-year. She didn't offer me any, which told me this conversation was heading somewhere uncomfortable. "My family has owned this estate for 90 years, Mr. Hayes. We've employed dozens of caretakers, managers, and staff members during that time. The successful ones learn to appreciate that some questions create more problems than answers." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle between us. "The unsuccessful ones found other employment." That night, I lay awake listening to the alpine wind howl across the mountains, but my thoughts kept returning to Mrs. Aldrich's warning. In my experience, the ultra-wealthy issued threats with the same casual precision they used for everything else: measured, calculated, and absolutely serious. Yet something else nagged at me. During our conversation, I'd noticed Mrs. Aldrich glancing repeatedly toward the window that faced the estate's eastern wing. Each time, her expression had tightened almost imperceptibly, as though she were watching for something specific. At 2:30 in the morning, unable to sleep, I decided to investigate. I dressed quietly and made my way through the estate's corridors, my footsteps muffled by thick carpeting that cost more per square foot than most people earned in a week. The third floor felt different at night, colder, despite the efficient heating system. The usual ambient sounds of a large house, settling timbers, distant mechanical hums, seemed muted, as though the building itself were holding its breath. The sealed room glowed more brightly than usual, warm light spilling from beneath the door in a steady, comforting band. But tonight, I heard something new. Not just the crackle of burning logs, but voices. Low, indistinct murmurs that rose and fell like conversation. I pressed my ear to the door, trying to distinguish words from the gentle sound of flames consuming wood. The voices were definitely human, at least 2 people, speaking in what sounded like German or perhaps Swiss dialect. Human voices, in a room that had been sealed for 34 years. "Would you like me to continue with sections 7 through 12? I remained at the door for nearly an hour, straining to decipher the muffled conversation within. The voices spoke in Swiss German, a dialect I recognized but couldn't fully understand. What disturbed me most was their casual intimacy. These weren't the hurried whispers of intruders, but the comfortable exchanges of people who belonged there. The next morning brought fresh snowfall and Mrs. Aldrich's announcement that she would be hosting a small dinner party on New Year's Eve. As I coordinated with the catering staff, I noticed Klaus watching me with unusual intensity. "You heard them talking, didn't you?" he asked quietly, when we found ourselves alone in the service kitchen. I hesitated, then nodded. Klaus sighed heavily, his shoulders sagging as though he'd been carrying a tremendous weight. "I should tell you something," he said, glancing around to ensure we weren't overheard. "Then about what happened in 1973. Klaus led me to his maintenance workshop, a cluttered space filled with spare parts and tools that somehow remained meticulously organized. He poured coffee from a thermos, his hands trembling slightly. "Mr. Aldrich, Mrs. Aldrich's husband had a brother named Heinrich. Heinrich lived here year-round, unlike the rest of the family who only came for winters. He was different, spent most of his time in that room, reading, writing, thinking. The family called him eccentric, but he wasn't eccentric." Klaus paused, staring into his coffee as though it contained answers to questions he'd never wanted to ask. "And he was dying. Lung cancer," Klaus continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "Heinrich had maybe 6 months when the doctors finished their tests. But he refused treatment. Said he'd rather spend his remaining time in the place he loved most." Klaus gestured toward the estate's upper floors. That room was his study, his library, his sanctuary. He'd installed a massive stone fireplace, had it shipped from a monastery in Bavaria. Said the old stones held warmth better than anything modern. I thought about the impossible heating efficiency, the warm light that appeared each night without fail. "What happened to him?" "Heinrich died in February of 1973. Mr. Aldrich found him in his chair by the fireplace, surrounded by his books. Peaceful, they said. Natural causes." Klaus's expression darkened. "But strange things started happening immediately after the funeral." "What kind of strange things?" "The fireplace kept burning. No one lit it, no one added wood, but every night it would come alive. The room stayed warm even when the rest of the estate was freezing." "Mrs. Aldrich, she was young then, newly married. She wanted to clear out Heinrich's belongings and convert the space." Klaus shook his head. "Mr. Aldrich refused. Said Heinrich had found a way to stay, and disturbing him would be disrespectful. So they sealed the room instead, thinking that would contain whatever was happening. But it didn't stop." "No," Klaus said quietly. "It never stopped. Heinrich is still there, still keeping the room warm, still reading his books. That evening I found myself outside Mrs. Aldrich's study, hesitating before knocking." The conversation with Klaus had answered some questions while raising dozens of others. If Heinrich Aldrich had somehow remained in that sealed room for 34 years, what did that mean for the living family members who continued to benefit from his presence? "Come in, Mr. Hayes," Mrs. Aldrich called before I could knock. She sat behind an antique writing desk, fountain pen poised over what appeared to be correspondence. Even at 73 now, she maintained the rigid posture and immaculate appearance that marked her generation of wealthy women. "Klaus spoke with you today," she said without preamble. "It wasn't a question." "Yes, ma'am." "About Heinrich." Mrs. Aldrich set down her pen and fixed me with that penetrating stare. "Dad, what did you think of Klaus's story? I think it explains the heating efficiency and the nightly firelight, but not why we've allowed it to continue." I remained silent, sensing she wanted to explain rather than be questioned. "My late husband loved his brother deeply, Mr. Hayes. Heinrich was brilliant, a scholar, a philosopher, someone who understood beauty in ways the rest of us could never grasp. When Heinrich chose to die here rather than waste away in some sterile hospital, Charles respected that choice." She paused, her fingers tracing patterns on the desk's polished surface. "What we didn't expect was Heinrich's refusal to leave. You have to understand that," Mrs. Aldrich continued. "This family has never believed in the supernatural. We're practical people. German stock built our fortune through careful planning and rational decisions. But Heinrich's presence, it defied every rational explanation we could construct." She rose from her chair and moved to the window that faced the eastern wing. Even from the ground floor, I could see the faint glow emanating from the third floor. The first winter after Heinrich died, our heating costs dropped by 40%. The estate stayed warmer than it ever had, as though the building itself had learned to conserve energy more efficiently. We brought in engineers, heating specialists, energy consultants. None could explain it, so you decided to accept it. We decided to honor it. Mrs. Aldrich's voice carried a mixture of sadness and resignation. Heinrich spent 47 years in this house. If he chose to stay, we felt we had no right to force him out. But the voices I heard, plural voices. Heinrich isn't alone, Mrs. Aldrich turned from the window, and for the first time since I'd known her, she looked genuinely vulnerable. No, Mr. Hayes, he isn't alone anymore. She returned to her desk, opening a drawer and withdrawing a leather-bound photograph album. My husband died 8 years ago. Heart attack, very sudden. We buried him in the family plot in Zurich, but she gestured toward the eastern wing. Charles found his way home. Mrs. Aldrich opened the photograph album, revealing decades of family pictures. Her fingers lingered on a black and white image of 2 men standing beside the estate's original entrance. One tall and scholarly, the other shorter but powerfully built. Heinrich and Charles, 1968, she said softly. They were inseparable as children, remained best friends as adults despite their very different personalities. Charles built the family's business empire, while Heinrich pursued his books and philosophy. 2 sides of the same soul. She turned the page, showing more recent photographs. Charles at various ages, always impeccably dressed, often standing beside the very fireplace where I now spent my evenings. When Charles died, I expected grief. What I didn't expect was the immediate change in the sealed room. The firelight grew brighter, the voices began. Klaus heard them first, 2 men speaking in Swiss German, discussing books, sharing memories, laughing like they did when they were young. I studied the photographs, trying to imagine these long-dead brothers maintaining their eternal conversation in a room I could never enter. Why don't you find it disturbing? Mrs. Aldrich smiled, the first genuine warmth I'd seen from her. Mr. Hayes, I'm 83 years old. I've buried my husband. My children live across the ocean, and most of my friends are gone. Knowing that Charles found his way back to the place where he was happiest, it's not disturbing. She closed the album gently. It's the only comfort I have left. Mrs. Aldrich died peacefully in her sleep 3 winters later, on a February night, when the Alpine winds howled like mourning spirits around the estate. I found her the next morning, still in her chair by the study fireplace, a small smile on her lips as though she'd heard something wonderful just before drifting away. The estate passed to distant relatives who showed no interest in maintaining an alpine retreat. Within 6 months, the property was listed for sale. My services were no longer required, but before leaving, I made one final walk through the corridors that had become my second home. The sealed room glowed more brightly than ever. Pressing my ear to the door one last time, I heard not 2 voices but 3, the familiar murmur of Heinrich and Charles now joined by the lighter tones of a woman speaking affectionate Swiss German. They sounded content, these voices from across time, sharing stories and warmth in a space that defied every rule I thought I understood. The new owners arrived in spring, a tech mogul and his wife who spoke of renovations and modernization. I never learned whether they discovered the sealed room's secret or chose to honor the family's long-standing arrangement. But sometimes, during particularly cold nights in my new position, I find myself thinking about that impossible fireplace and the family that refused to let death separate them. Some loves burn too bright to ever be extinguished.